Hi, welcome back to our second episode of Weediya. Thank you very much for the overwhelmingly positive response you've given our program. In our current episode of Weediya, what we'd like to look at is whether Hindus have been written out of the script in some way. Have they been excluded out of the political space, out of the cultural space, which is normally available to other people? Today we've got our panelists. Our panelists are Gautam Sen, who is ex-London School of Economics. We've got Saiswaroopa Iyer over here, who is an independent researcher and a Carnatic music singer. And of course we've got Prakash Shah as well over here. And Prakash is a reader in culture and law at the Queen Mary's in the University of London. Welcome back to our show, Prakash and Gautam, and welcome to our show, Saiswaroopa. Thanks for being here. I know you've all traveled from different parts of the country to make it to Birmingham again for the second episode of Weediya. A few days before this particular program, I had the opportunity to interview Maria Wirth. We just cut to some of the things which she said.
There has been an attempt to make Hindu tradition look so bad that nobody wanted to be associated with it anymore. That people would feel even ashamed to be called Hindus. Of course, this was not possible with the majority of Indians, but the British succeeded quite well to make the elite think like this. Their strategy was, of course, brainwashing children. They replaced the Sanskrit education system with the English education system, and from that time onwards, they taught Indian children that their tradition is not worth anything. And children, of course, believed it. The descendants of these children, even after independence, continued to be very negative towards their own tradition without knowing anything about it. But even in the West, there was an attempt to malign Hinduism and give it no space anymore. Like, it is often not even mentioned when religions are mentioned, and when it is mentioned, it is portrayed as the worst of all.
So I'd like to start with you, Gautam, first. Have Hindus effectively been written out of the script? Has there been a concerted attempt in some manner to write Hindus politically and culturally out of the normal script of things?
I think this is true mainly of the mainstream media, and from the evidence that we see of much of official institutions to do with the government of India.
Yes.
Hindus have a very hard time being represented. But of course, below that level in civil society, there is a flourishing life of Hindus in culture, in faith, in music, and many, many other dimensions.
Right. Would you like to elaborate on that further, on the first bit of it?
The mainstream media is really dominated by the so-called secular left.
Which is not really secular, in the traditional sense of the word, as definition
I think that it would be kind to say they have no idea what secular means, but that's par for the course. But it is a very useful weapon, kind of thing.
Call yourself secular when you're actually not secular.
It's a kind of wife-beating question. When did you last beat your wife?
Yes.
Is what they use secularism for. Whenever the issue of Hinduism comes, it is never even mentioned in a whisper when you talk about other faiths, particularly monotheistic faiths. They are not required to exhibit secularism, but Hindus have to be secular, which is they must be skeptical of their faith, they must be embarrassed at the very least, and of course apologetic as well. Now, the official agencies really were the playground of this secular left. They are very slightly in retreat and extremely alarmed, as if the world is on the verge of coming to an end. And they associate this with this allegedly monstrous man who's become our Prime Minister, which is causing an enormous amount of mirth and enjoyment for the rest of us who find this to be the new norm.
Okay, now why do you think that all these people feel so threatened by Narendra Modi? I mean, is it because he's a Hindu? Is it because he's the first Prime Minister of India who is calling himself unashamedly Hindu?
This really is the horror of horrors, that we have a Prime Minister who proclaims himself to be a devout Hindu. No matter what he does, once you've said you're a Hindu, you have totally condemned yourself for all eternity, and I'm afraid this is a problem for him. And of course, you will recall that magnificent inauguration on the banks of the Ganga for his inauguration with the Arati, which filled our hearts with joy and gladness. Now this is held against him, but people dare not bring this up because it was so enormously, resoundingly welcomed and popular with the vast ordinary masses of Hindus right across India, uniting our country under the umbrella of one faith.
Now, this is interesting, isn't it? When you look at some of the responses which occurred at that point of time, there was a particular response from a mainstream media journalist who I do not want to name, of course, but everybody knows who she is. And she sort of said that why did Narendra Modi not visit a mosque? Now, if this was a member of another community who was our Prime Minister, for example, would they have suggested that that person visit a temple? But yet, over here, for some reason, there was this overriding concern on the part of this particular journalist that why did Narendra Modi not visit a mosque? I mean, I couldn't figure it out. Would you like to say something about this?
You know, this is the kind of silliness which you associate with the Indian mainstream media, particularly with this television channel and their anchors. Why should Narendra Modi, or indeed any leader, go to a mosque?
Or any faith?
No, go to a mosque to undertake a public relations stunt and humiliate and insult the devout of that faith. Because that is what it would have amounted to. He is not a Muslim, so why should he do that? What matters is in civil society, how do we treat all other faiths in our country?
And we treat them pretty well.
We do not treat them well. We treat them better than the majority community. In law and in practice, they have many more privileges. That's something I would like to come back to later on.
Saiswaroopa, would you like to comment on this question? For example, do you think Hindus are being written out of the script in some way?
I think it's more of a selective highlighting of the part which excludes Hindus out of the mainstream narrative. So you highlight those academicians who have a not so reverent perspective about Hinduism. You highlight those politicians who have not so good things to say about Hindu politicians or Hindu researchers, and you highlight some one-off instances where some unfortunate incidences happened and put the total blame on Hinduism. So, and it's kind of orchestrated, might be a mild word, because it's scripted and directed in such a way that the multi-directional attack is pointed out.
And it is
onto
always
Hinduism.
on Hindus.
Yes.
And this is the thing. I mean, whenever any Hindu wants, Gautam, you want to come back?
I make a very quick point, perhaps a mischievous one, which is to say that, Hindus, like everybody else, are obviously occasionally going to commit crimes that we will find reprehensible. And of course, immediately, the activity of one solitary individual or a small political group is imputed to the entire community, that all Hindus are blamed.
Yes.
Whereas if it is somebody from a monotheistic faith who does something which is terrible and which shocks us, we say, no, this particular individual has some psychiatric or personal problem.
Yes.
It is not the responsibility of their
Yes.
entire community. Only Hindus have to carry this baggage wherever they go.
There was that incident somewhere in Pune, isn't it, where a couple of people were basically, I think there were a few people from the minority community who faced some violence, and then after that immediately all the Hindus were sort of targeted and said, it was said the mainstream media had this absolute narrative going that Hindus are bad, okay, and then the same thing happened in the opposite direction, as it happens every few days, and there the mainstream media did not say a single word.
Obviously, being Indian citizens, we find this very demoralizing. In this particular case, innocent man was killed.
Yes, it was a terrible incident.
In broad daylight, and of course, when you have such an event and people start abusing you, you feel unable to answer because you feel terrible and you should feel terrible. And the Hindu reaction is to always, feel demolished when such things takes place, and they should feel bad. But there should be some sense of proportion, that the people in Kanyakumari and the people in Kashmir or wherever, Hindus, are not responsible for the work of one evil murderer in Pune. But what can one say?
Now, at the same time, if we take, for example, what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir, coming from that point of view, what Gautam was just saying, at that point of time, you found a lot of people from the mainstream media actually completely glossing over that incident. And so, is this something, Prakash? Would you like to come in on this at this point?
The attacks, victimization of Hindus need not be taken so seriously, right? But the attacks and so on, even alleged attacks, the imputed attacks upon those who belong to the Semitic religions, are immediately sort of highlighted and promoted and so on. And actually, the whole of India stands accused, actually, of being an irresponsible country which treats its minority.
An intolerant country. Suddenly it becomes intolerant.
Yeah. But going back to the issue of secular and not being secular, I think actually there are people, there are academicians who suggest that, say, India has a different idea of secularism to the Western idea, and so my own view is that actually there is only one idea of secularism, and you have to trace it back to Semitic theology and Protestant theology to be more precise. And the application of that theological framework on a country like India has had devastating consequences for the status of those who practice the Indian traditions. And all the instances that my colleagues are mentioning are actually completely consistent with the kind of shame that ordinary Indians have developed in terms of looking at and in fact turning their backs on their ancestral traditions. And that's actually been the effect, a direct effect of secularism and the kind of culture that secularism has promoted, particularly among the elites in India.
Now, is that secularism as it is defined, or secularism as it is defined in India?
No.
Or both.
As I'm trying to say, actually, there is only one secularism, right? And it derives directly from Protestant theology.
Yes.
Right, and because of that theological framework, one has to be ashamed of one's ancestral tradition. Right. So, and this is part of the elite culture in India today, particularly the kind of secular left. Culture that was referred to earlier, and so it's completely consistent with upholding secularism on the one hand and deriding one's own ancestral traditions. There is no contradiction there, actually, And you find that so deeply seated within institutions of academia, within the political system, and so on, to the extent that even people who are ostensibly Hindu,
Yes.
they have developed a kind of shame when it comes to presenting their own tradition in the public sphere. I mean, you see that very interestingly with the yoga controversy now.
Yes.
How particular aspects of the Indian traditions have to be somehow subdued or even dropped
Right.
if one wants to make yoga a global product,
Yes.
if you like, or
Yes.
globally accessible.
Yes.
This is also an aspect of shame, and shamefully, it's actually a pro-Hindu party which is in power in government, which is also being compelled to engage in this kind of shenanigans.
Would you like to comment on this?
I would just like to say, in addition to what Prakash has already, secular revolution in Europe really was to do with two important interrelated issues. The first was the fact that the church enjoyed ultimate and oppressive political authority over people and institutions. And that was proving a great barrier to progress and change. And also the fact that they were in control in many ways over the cultural, aesthetic, and scientific life of society.
Yes, the church was, yes.
And they had ultimate sanction, and we of course know they burned Giordano Bruno at the stake, and of course they showed the great Galileo the instruments of torture
Galileo, yes.
to force him to recant.
Yes.
And though of course he quietly said and still it moves.
Yes.
About the direction in which these.
Hypatia also.
Yeah, and then of course Hypatia, of course a much earlier instance, much earlier, but we're talking about the recent past. Now, this was not the reality of Hindu society,
Yes.
where the mendicant Brahmins had neither political authority nor the ability to influence culture and the progress of science. On the contrary, science was very integral to the Hindu tradition
Yes.
and celebrated by it.
Yes.
So secularism really became a convenient weapon, and I'd like to make 2 or 3 remarks as to why this happened historically.
Okay.
I think the first aspect of the misrepresentation of Hinduism and the attempt finally to write it out of the script, actually it has been much worse in independent India than it was under the British Empire. This is the great tragedy. Hinduism flourished much more during
That's
the British
interesting.
Empire.
Why do you say that?
Well, it was Warren Hastings,
Yes.
the much reviled Warren Hastings, who wrote fulsome praise of Bhagavad Gita as something which will endure for all time to come. I don't see many secular Hindus
Yes.
ever saying such a thing about the Bhagavad Gita. Now, I think the first reason why Hinduism was a problem is a very straightforward one, which we don't need to research very deeply. It is absolutely blindingly obvious, which is that polytheism and paganism were abhorrent to monotheistic faiths.
Yes.
And indeed, a much acclaimed Englishman who came to India in 1793,
Yes.
William Carey,
Yes.
was still referred to with great reverence as Carey Sahab in Bengal,
Yes.
because he was the man who authored the first grammar of Bengali as well as important books in Sanskrit, actually to translate the Bible. But even William Carey was very, very clear. He thought Hinduism was demonic, that it was characterized by bloodlust and devil worship, and they must be brought to Christ. So that's the first thing, that there is an underlying theme
Yes.
in the culture of other societies and how they view Hinduism, that it is abhorrent. Now, they may tell you pretty stories on television now and then to simply distract you while they go about the business of conversion, to save your soul, of course, but there is an abhorrence. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, if you want to rule over a country like India, you've got to culturally disempower the main source of the ideology, which would have to come from the history of its society, its faith,
Yes.
which is Hinduism.
Yes.
So there was a political imperative. Now, in the first generations of British rule, the Hindus were an ally because they were seeking to consolidate their rule over what was still significantly an Islamic society.
Yes.
Though Muslims had really been defeated by the Jats, Sikhs and the Marathas before the British appeared on the scene and, in a way, stole away the prize by being very clever. Now, therefore, Hindus were an ally for a little while, but by the 1870s, 1880s, and the Congress Party was established, they sensed that these Hindus were the troublesome people who are now educated
Yes.
in the English idiom. They know our language, they know our culture, they read our history books, and they're now using it against them.
Yes.
Because the Hindus really were using John Locke, just like the Americans,
Yes.
to justify
Yes.
their demand for autonomy to start with, self-respect, and then independence. So Hindus obviously became a problem, the Hindu elite. So they very smartly said, these Brahmins who oppress everybody else who are not Hindus really, are the ones who are trying to stop us looking after the poor and the wretched. Of course, the poor and the wretched were dying by the million in famines which were sponsored by the British. The records are very, very clear. That's the third thing. The second part of the story. The third part of the story is, you see, after partition, our leaders, rightly or wrongly, wanted to reassure the Muslims. And the one thing they didn't want to do is to give Hinduism any prominence in society, because they thought it might
Yes.
spook
Yes.
Muslims. So Nehru and his cohort created institutions
Like-
which would systematically deny the relevance of Hinduism in our society. And in many ways, you see, Jawaharlal Nehru was a creature of the Indo-Islamic world.
Yes.
He had the culture of somebody who came from this Indo-Islamic world, and I have heard from people who worked with him directly as young activists that he was uncomfortable Hindu gurus.
He didn't quite like Hindu gurus or
at all,
even Hinduism.
and he was, I'm told, much more comfortable with the Nawabi style of the Pathans and the Sikhs to keep him company. So all of this is of a piece. Now then, this became a bit of a monster, because you incited the minorities to become a vote bank, and so this had to be consolidated and institutionalized, that Hinduism, being part of the script, is a big political problem.
Yes.
So these things in combination disempowered Hindus, at least in the official level of society, in these institutions. And I should know myself, because I came from a very left-wing stable. I worked
Yes.
for a long time with a hard left newspaper called Frontier in Calcutta.
Yes.
And I didn't hardly meet anybody who had any sympathy for Hinduism. I was even then a skeptic, but I did not regard this as a great evil.
No.
I remain
A skeptic.
an agnostic. I am not a believer in the traditional sense, but I do believe Hinduism has so much to offer, and
Yes.
it's something worth defending on its intrinsic merits, even for somebody who is not really a Hindu in the traditional sense of being a temple worshipper, though I am very respectful because it is important to the people I respect.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. We are going to take a very short break now, okay? And when we come back, we're going to discuss this point a bit further. Cut. So, welcome back. In this segment, what we're going to talk about is just one of the points which we had touched upon a bit earlier about this idea of a fundamentalist Hindu and how this has been sort of caricatured in the West, also in India, by the mainstream media in particular, but also by academics. So I'm just going to take this to Saiswaroopa over here. Saiswaroopa ji, what do you think about this sort of caricature, this sort of misrepresentation of Hindus?
It's totally baseless to start with. I mean, I won't mince words there, because the fundamentalism doesn't exist in the very soul of Hinduism. I'm reminded of a Tyagaraja Pancharatna Kriti.
Yes.
It starts with Endaro Mahanubhavulu Andariki Vandanamulu, which means there are many great souls, and Mahanubhava means many souls with experience.
Yes.
And all of them are worth my bowing down, and I bow down to all of them. And this has 10 stanzas in which Tyagaraja, he actually describes the different ways in which devotees seek divinity. There are ones pursuing music, there are ones pursuing different arts, there are
Yes.
ones reading scriptures, there are ones doing service, there are ones
Karma Yoga.
Karma Yoga, there are ones singing the
Bhakti
glories,
Yoga, and so on.
Bhakti, and so on. And the soul of Hinduism, it recognizes these different ways.
Yes.
And its Tyagaraja is just one example. And if we go to the compositions of each and every, I think Bhakti movement composers, I think we'll find
So to summarize what you're saying a little bit, so to call the Hindus as being fundamentalist, I mean that's Gautam. Would you just like to come in and what is the definition of fundamentalist?
I think the reason why the term fundamentalism is applied to Hindus is because it has a negative connotation.
Yes.
So it is thrown in like the kitchen sink, that you have a term of abuse. But intellectually speaking, this is misapplied because first of all, fundamentalism is about fidelity to the texts of the scripture.
And which text are you going to apply in
the case of Hindus, this actually cannot be established.
Yes.
That they are rigidly interpreting the text and say which says stone.
Which text?
Well, which says stone the adulteress to death, so you stone the adulteress to death. But this is not quite the way Hindu texts are viewed and used. And the great Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali, the medieval theologian, is the one who won the debate on saying fidelity to the text and God's word is the final arbiter.
Yes.
And he banished reason as being an alternative, that is human reason and interpretation. And he won the debate, unfortunately perhaps. Now in the case of Hindus, I forget who it was, the dialogue in the Mahabharata where one protagonist says, but what happens to us if all our gurus have died and all the sages have gone? To which the respondent says, but we have the power of reason.
Yes.
That is the defining feature of Hinduism. That all said and done, for all its defects and shortcomings, and I'm sure given time, seculars would have no issue finding plenty. That is the reigning principle, that the power of human reason and experience is the ultimate arbiter. And that is why even for somebody like myself who's an arbiter, I am very respectful of the traditions and the faith of my ancestors.
See, this is interesting, Gautam. A few days ago, I will not name the particular TV anchor, but there was a debate between her and this particular economist, famous economist, and I will not name the TV channel, but I'm sure all our viewers know exactly what we are talking about. And there was this underspin over there that Hinduism is horrible, Hinduism is terrible, and the economist did not even try to defend it. You see, this is the kind of spin which the mainstream media puts on virtually everything Hindu.
I should perhaps alert you that there is one type of adherent of the Brahmo Samaj who is actually very hostile to Hinduism.
Yes.
And this is what actually was being communicated by their silence. Not all Brahmo Samajas are sympathetic to Hinduism.
Yes.
So this is what was going on. And of course, it has long been open season on Hindus, so anything goes, even if it's not credible, even if it's flimsy, it's perfectly acceptable to our mainstream media, most of whom are actually pretty clueless and not very well educated, and their grammar is usually okay, just about.
A few days before this particular program, I had the opportunity to interview Maria Wirth, who's of course a German who stayed in India for an extremely long time, and she had some very interesting views, some very interesting points to make within the framework of this debate.
It is certainly quite audacious to call Hindus of all people as communal and extremist. Hindus are the ones who say that the whole world is one family. They wouldn't even have borders to other religions if the other religions would not insist on creating borders. I feel calling them communal is a case of attack is the best defense. Just look at Christianity. They claim we alone are right, we alone have the true God, we alone have the truth and are saved. And unless you get baptized and join us, you will rot eternally in hellfire. Is this not communal? Does this make sense? Is such a claim even possible?
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in this episode of Weediya. Thank you very much for your continuing support, and I'm sure you will all watch this version as well. As you know, we have cross-platform applicability in this particular program, and this is sent out on WhatsApp to every university in India as far as we can manage. So if you want any episode of Weediya on WhatsApp, please contact us through saraswatifilms.org. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.